Alright, I want to be kind of quick here because sun's going down, but I just wanted to talk a bit about this hypothesis I formed while paying down my student loans. This is going to be more of a podcast with the gameplay being mostly superfluous, but I may include some graphics as needed. And I've just been hollowing out most of a stony shore for its gravel. I haven't gotten into too many of the caves and crevices yet. So debt is a pretty complex topic which people tend to have rather strong opinions about. If we start talking about student loans, things get particularly controversial, political even. But bear with me because I believe that most of us will at the very least agree that federal student loan service providers suck. And I suspect that that is by design. To be fair, you're trapped with very few options. They don't really have an incentive to be any better, but I believe the entire user experience is designed to be as painful as possible. If I need more, I come back. At a surface level glance, it might make sense at first that these loan management companies have very little incentive to invest in improving themselves. With the threat of debt nullification constantly on the table as a political campaign point, of course they aren't going to spend on interface redesigns. Although that talking point is likely nothing more than political propaganda, a promise which was never made in good faith. And moreover, if it ever did come to pass, they'd probably be reimbursed in a bailout. Actually, even when we assume that loan forgiveness poses no real threat to these companies, making the experience of paying off your debts early as convoluted and annoying as possible is actually more profitable for these companies than streamlining your experience would be. So they never really had an excuse, they just can get away with it because they know it's not fiscally responsible for you to dodge them and will bend you over accordingly. Interestingly enough, these federal loan providers actually do have their own escape, and they're allowed to collapse and ultimately have your debt change hands from one slimy monopoly tendril to the next every few months as these corporations claim bailout after bailout on a debt that even your own bankruptcy will not save you from. They can afford to have a two-factor authenticator which sends your email the wrong code and threatens to lock you out so that you have to call during their business hours when you're probably at work. And on the off chance that the code does work, they'll remember me for 90 days so that you don't have to go through their two-factor authentication every time you log in. Never seems to work for some reason. While both of those are worth talking about, I believe that there's something far sleazier, if not overtly sinister, to discuss. As a disclaimer, I am not a financial advisor. This is purely anecdotal from my own experience, and it should not constitute financial advice. Let's say that you're doing everything right, you're making all your payments on time. That's great. Maybe you even find yourself with a little bit of extra money and you're trying to decide what to do with that cash. While I was doing my own research, I discovered that a lot of the financial philosophy out there is pretty monolithic in nature, and the prevailing advice tends to view student loans as a so-called form of good debt. I choose to take that with a heaping spoonful of salt. Not that I am entirely cynical. I still believe that investing into your own learning, skill building, and general self-improvement is incredibly valuable. However, I remain skeptical of student loans being good debt, as the vast majority of those writings are either themselves outdated or simply parrot the outdated advice without taking into account the declining return on investment of college. As tuition rises, wages stagnate, and we find ourselves sitting near the top of what we can only assume is a massive economic bubble, is that degree actually worth going into tens of thousands in debt for? Let's assume you say yes, either because the career that you wish to pursue requires a degree or because society has pressured you into pursuing that degree for one reason or another. So you take out those loans, get your degree, maybe get a job in the field that you were pursuing, and you start trying to figure out how you want to invest any surplus simoleons you manage to scratch out. The prevailing notion is that it's often best to sleep on your student loans, which have interest rates lower than the average rate of return which investment opportunities can yield you. In other words, that debt is at a fixed interest rate, and you just need to beat it in order to win more than you lose, which on average you should do within the markets. An optimistic point of view, necessary when taking on new risks. Taking a more pragmatic look at things, the debt is guaranteed, and the odds of a market crash at the moment are presently pretty high. We've already been in a recession for a few years, and it might not get better anytime soon. I'm not entirely bearish on the market by any means, but I'm not going to place all of my eggs into a basket which could lose 80% of its value overnight, and leave me owing the government the same amount as I had 2 nights prior. So I've taken a rather aggressive approach to reducing my debt, and in doing so I've discovered that these federal loan servicers have managed to devise the absolute scummiest thing in their power to exploit against you, the loan borrower. They force you to opt out of having your payment date moved up every time that you make a payment which would get you ahead of your scheduled loan repayment. That is to say, you need to manually click an extra button every time you make an excess payment on your loans. And if you don't, then they push out your next due date until you have accrued enough interest to be back on your original schedule. Everything has an opportunity cost, whether you're investing or clearing off debts. By paying ahead of an outstanding loan balance, you sacrifice the ability to invest those funds elsewhere, with the expectation that you will lose less over time in interest on the debt. The truly sinister thing about quietly forcing you back onto the original debt track by default is not the loss of potential gains, or even the paltry interest which a savings account could have accrued in the meantime. The most despicable thing about it all is that these companies are robbing you of leverage. They are punishing you for trying to be diligent, and there is an implication that their goal, their true goal, is to keep you tethered to your debt regardless of the subsidies that they receive from the government. Or, perhaps, more cynically, the government actually incentivizes them to make this process of paying off your federal loans as obtuse as possible. But there's no need to speculate at the moment, because we aren't here to let these leeches steal the very winds from our sails. There is a way to stop them from robbing your hard work, attempting to nullify your efforts at making excess payments to escape your debt. The solution is actually pretty straightforward, too. Just pay off your loans one at a time. A 5% interest rate on a $0 balance is still $0. If you try to get ahead on all of them at once, or if you don't explicitly specify which loan to pay off, you leave room for a shady loan manager to allocate those funds across the board in a way where you make no real progress and are more likely to fall back onto the original course which they had scheduled for you. Naturally, this is easier said than done because the providers don't actually want you paying off your debts early. At the moment, there's no penalty for doing so, as there's a servicing fee from the very moment that your loan gets dispersed, and you immediately lose value on it. It's a bit like driving a brand new car off the lot. They have already made money from you just by taking out the loan in the first place, but they're greedy, and they still want every last penny of interest which they can possibly collect from you. When I first realized that my next payment due dates were being pushed back to extort the maximum amount of interest from me, I decided to start recording my findings, with the intent to highlight how ridiculous these companies really are. With a under $200 balance remaining at the time, the most recent loan which I paid off had a next due date of January 22nd, 2035, which would be 5% compounding debt for over 10 years. And they just wouldn't write you a bill for a decade or more because they want you to pay the interest on it. Now, I wasn't going to deal with that. I made a payment of what was the remaining balance the day that I tried to make the payment. And a few days and some processing later, and there was 2 cents remaining on the balance because reasons, and the program didn't even want to calculate out my next due date for me. Now, when these companies are so desperate to keep you indebted to them that they hold you for 2 cents and would continue trapping you for decades with it, how can I forgo giving my 2 cents? Loan forgiveness programs are mostly propaganda. How do I mean? At face value, wherein the forgiveness programs are a pillar for a hastily constructed political campaign, while the contention of such programs remains a talking point for political rivals. But there's something more perverse resting below the surface. There already existed a forgiveness program, a long-running program in fact, within which, if you were to make at least minimum payments while remaining employed by a qualifying company, one eligible for the program, then after a decade without a missed payment, some or all of your federal loans would be forgiven. There are stipulations to that, and it's worth a read, but I believe that program is where the ill-conceived notion, the Mandela Effect that student loans only follow you for a decade, began to be parroted within the public education system. Perhaps it's that our public educators all qualified for this program, a topic worth discussion unto itself. Regardless of how the information first began being propagated, it seems to me like an excellent entry point for a sunken cost fallacy loop about higher education. I will elaborate further on that, but I am curious to know if it's just my own personal experience and that of my immediate university peers, or if others actually do recall that from between freshman year of high school and throughout college, that people just say that it's washed away after 10 years. Is banking on one of these debt forgiveness programs logical? Let's assume that you attended a college which you needed loans to afford at the time, with the intent to take advantage of this 10-year program to wipe the slate after only making minimum payments. At some point, you might begin your journey towards becoming more financially literate because you understand that the public schools were pretty lackluster for money management, and that all of these blog posts, books, journal entries, articles, and videos are in agreement that student loan debt is okay debt to carry, and it's most beneficial for you to just let it ride. At a glance, what they're saying might sound reasonable. Obviously, the average 7 to 8% return in the market is better for your books than saving yourself from losing a 4% loss. It works out to a net of positive 3% for you. And if you are someone that qualifies for forgiveness in 10 years, then it's just the minimum payments and you don't even need to think about the compounding interest on the other side. Or do you? There's no guarantee that the market won't crash, and if or when it does, your debts will continue compounding. There's no way to ensure that you're able to maintain a job which qualifies for the program for 10 years running. You could be 9 years into it of just making minimum payments and find yourself unemployed and back on the hook for the entire balance. Then what are you going to do? Were you budgeting and investing for that? Or did you allow lifestyle creep to occur because you were anticipating a bailout? Let's look at it from a different angle. If you weren't on the hook for those loans, which even bankruptcy cannot save you from, would you even be doing whatever it is that you are currently doing? Have your student loans robbed you of your freedom? Any economist will tell you that past results do not guarantee future outcomes. However, looking at current trends, coupled with outcomes from decisions made years ago which are only now finally coming to the surface, it just seems that it might be time for us to take a step back and reevaluate things, and at least open the channels for discussion with each other about this. There are many people approaching retirement age who have seen that goalpost being steadily pushed further back, and some who were already retired that are being forced to re-enter the workforce. That should be reason enough for most of us to realize that the prevailing advice for autopiloting one's way towards financial success might be a bit out of date. Financial success itself is a highly subjective topic, and it goes well beyond the scope of this video about student loans. Thankfully, we don't actually need to outline what that success would mean to yourself versus what it would mean to me versus what John Doe would believe would constitute winning the game, so to speak, nor do we need to agree fully about what financial failure looks like. We don't even need to address every problem at once, and I assure you that the problems are multinumerous. As long as everybody is loosely in agreement that there is one or more problems with how the proverbial game is played, then we could start sharing our own problems, getting feedback, and finding solutions. The internet is an excellent platform for helping us find solutions to our problems. Somebody clever might hear somebody else's problem and find a way to sell a solution to that person. And you might realize that that is exactly what an entrepreneur does. A particularly sly or otherwise crooked entrepreneur might take advantage of their developed salesperson's skill set and hawk something which doesn't fix the problem, or worse, causes more problems, And in modern days, I've heard these snake oil salesmen referred to by the term Contrepreneur, that being con artist plus entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs, both good and bad, flock to wherever a perceived problem can be solved. As such, pockets discussing financial wellness tend to be flooded by wannabe gurus. This is not to say that all financial advice on the internet is bad, just that it is important to check for bias and to do your own research. It is extremely unlikely that any sort of finance influencer is going to have any secret to share which would warrant paying them for a course when you could instead invest that money into an actual degree. And before you at me in the comments, yes, I understand the irony in taking that stance in a video about how ludicrous tuition costs and student loans have become. My point is that they probably have nothing more than an Econ 101 class in their own voice to offer you, and that is the least scammy of possibilities of what they could be giving you. And that's not to say that the free Econ 101 that you get out of whatever channel, video, stream, podcast, whatever they run, is bad. It's actually a very good way to get your bearings financially. However, it's safe to assume that they don't have any sort of real secret to becoming more successful financially, whatever that means to them, because they're going to have their own take on it. And the reason we know that they don't have the secret formula is because they wouldn't be trying to sell it to us. If they had it, they'd just be using it themselves. So let's assume that you know all of that about financial influencers. Take whatever free advice you get and put up the blinders and ignore whatever they're trying to sell you. Is the platform that they are hosting that information on monetized? If it is, then they are technically incentivized to have you come back as often as possible. And so even the good ones, the really good ones, are more likely than not going to be treating the symptoms rather than the disease. But pretty universally, whether I read it or listen to it, all of these influencers, all of these writers, financial advisors, gurus, etc., seem to be dead set on the idea that student loans are good debt relative to other types of debt. What was it that caused us all to agree that student loan debt was good at one point, and is it still? Well, when we're talking about federal student loan debt, it's at a relatively low interest rate, sometimes subsidized, sometimes not, but it's debt that you take on to increase your earning potential. At least it was back in the day when a entry-level position didn't require an additional 3 years of experience or a master's degree. Reasonably confident that that is at least partially due to market saturation by people who got degrees in fields that they have no actual passion for and no interest in. On the other hand, the demand for the work is there, and there's a very limited number of people who are actually qualified to do it. So the options are demeaning entry-level position to test the waters with you, or continue schooling for a higher-level degree at your own expense. Or, of course, the third option of going into a government sector, although they might force you to relocate, just uproot your entire life and go elsewhere. We have hordes of young adults who are well educated, but in a massive amount of debt, who are desperate for jobs in an allegedly saturated market, who either need to dig themselves deeper into debt to get a better paying job, or just accept whatever job and salary they can get, because they are bound by loans which even bankruptcy will not erase. So they find themselves willing to do the work for cheaper, anything to ensure that they're able to maintain this job so that they can actually keep paying back these loans which they can't otherwise get rid of, and also afford food and housing. Except most of them can't afford food and housing and are taking on roommates. They don't have the time or energy to fight for better wages right now. They can't afford to lose their job. They can't afford to unionize and risk being unemployed. So what student loans have done for our society is create extremely cheap educated labor. How cheap, you might ask? Well, I mean, they could choose to stop working if they wanted, but they wouldn't because of the implications. So when I discovered that my loan service provider is doing all sorts of subtle little things to try and prevent me from paying back my loans early, got me thinking. These payback platforms are really poorly designed in terms of user experience, meant to encourage setting up an auto pay at the minimum payment to avoid the headache of having to interact with them at all. They go as far as to incentivize this behavior by offering a marginal reduction in the interest rate if you are enrolled into the autopay. Consolidation programs, the alternative to actually dealing with these federal providers, most of them on the market are scammy at best, more designed to alleviate your own personal headache in dealing with the original service providers, but at the cost of greater fiscal penalties. You lose several of your own protections if you transfer your federal loan debt away from the feds, even though you are still ultimately on the hook if or when things go wrong. So the most effective tactic available for the vast majority of people is to enroll in the autopay and forget about the horrendous experience altogether. Because interacting with the site is psychologically painful, and since there is a reward, even if it's only slight, for setting up autopay in the form of a decrease in the interest rate, then autopay is doubly good, reinforcing the behavior of setting it up and not having to log back in, both increasing a reward and reducing a punishment. I can't be the only one detecting something Pavlovian here. So what happens if we choose to start looking at these student loans as a means of conditioning the working class? If you're enrolled in autopay for minimum payments and have slightly reduced interest rate on your loans, let's say, for example, it's dropped to about 4% per year. The stock market returns an average of 7 to 8% per year, year over year. So you can make an extra 3 to 4% by investing what you would otherwise be using to pay off your loans early. But what's the rate of inflation again? Alright, it's about 3% year over year before you take into account the hot mess which the most recent decade has been. Okay, well, maybe you qualify for that forgiveness program, and after 10 years of work for a specific subset of companies, they wipe the slate clean for you, so you toil for a decade, and we'll even assume that nothing goes wrong. You're actually able to hold that specific job for 10 years, no issues, and they wipe the slate clean for you, and you get to keep that cool 7% average year over year. Was that job fulfilling? Or did you actually earn all that you potentially could have, or was your earning there capped, or should we say shackled? I hope that didn't come off as sounding too jaded. I am looking at things, primarily discuss them with my peers who are from the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics background, and we all watched as the greatly anticipated legislation to end exploitative non-competes was suddenly thrown into limbo. To provide some context for anyone who happens to be out of the loop, there are countless incredibly talented young people out there who cannot currently start their own business in their field that they are licensed or certified for because these non-competes leave them vulnerable to potentially long and expensive legal battles with their current and past employers. Since anyone, including a corporation, can sue anybody at any time, current and former employees that are trying to do their own thing are the perfect targets for spiteful legal battles where you try and claim their intellectual property as something owned by the corporation and/or the fruits of their startup business as resources that should belong to the company itself. The corporations don't even need to win these battles because they take what are now effectively independent contractors out of the ability to make their own money, which leaves them with this really weird stranglehold over the market. But I digress. There could very well have been a time in the past when the advice to just sit on your student loans made sense. We'll give the benefit of a doubt and choose to believe that finance influencers simply haven't caught up with the modern realities of the world, encouraging us to do something which ultimately leaves us in a position where we need additional financial advice in the future. It's just so far-fetched. No one on the internet would ever mislead you, especially not those that are trying to sell you something. Assuming that the goal of the conditioning truly is to keep people making only minimum payments, then those people are going to remain in debt for extraordinarily long periods of time. Now, there are 3 major stances to student loan forgiveness: to have them forgiven, to not have them forgiven, and people who don't care either way. For the people I identify as those that don't care about the topic, we're speaking of people who haven't done enough analysis of the problem to actually form their own opinions and are either just parroting whatever they hear from their peers about it or whomever they get their news from. Personally, I've witnessed a pair of civil servants, one in medicine, the other one in legal, arguing in favor of student loan forgiveness against their father, who is retired at this point and in his late 60s, early 70s. Their dad was trying to convince them that they shouldn't want to see these loans forgiven for others because they had already paid off a big chunk of their own and had nothing to gain from others having those debts washed away. They firmly replied that having only just finished paying off their debts themselves, that the experience was miserable and that the return on investment was nowhere near what was sold to them when they were in high school. They are watching the disparity between what's being promised and what the reality of people graduating is steadily growing, and they wouldn't want anyone else to suffer through all of that. Their father tried to refute it at first, trying to claim that it couldn't be as bad as they were making it out to be and that they were exaggerating, up until the point where they laid all the figures out before him, and he was gobstruck by the financial reality of the educated working class these days. Now, their dad is pretty conservative. He's already retired, but he was a former union worker. And eventually, the realization that his daughter, with a master's degree working in the medical field, which he went to school for, cannot afford to unionize and fight for the appropriate wages, lest she risk his grandchildren starving. Very quickly gets a grandmaster chess player on board with the idea of subsidizing these loan alleviation efforts with the tax dollars that are already being collected. He had no real personal stake and was willing to just repeat whatever anyone told him initially. But as soon as it personally affected him via his daughter and his grandchildren, he ran out of arguments. Perfectly capable of rational thought, he had just never given this particular subject any critical thinking. In fact, most people without a strong personal stake at risk would agree that a loan forgiveness program would pave the way for more innovation, more opportunities to take risks. Opportunities which people don't have the time for when they're tethered to a wage-suppressed job. If people are free to innovate in their own ways, they are more likely to be able to prevent monopolies from taking root. Removing this debt wouldn't suddenly change the fact that competition breeds creation. So what about the people who really don't want to see these loans forgiven? Steadfastly so, no matter how you try to reason with them. By and large, they do have a personal stake in the matter. Namely, the loss of an incredibly desperate labor force which is willing to accept these suppressed wages. Now, the most common rhetoric is that I've paid off my student loans, these people should have to too, but when that echo chamber is primarily comprised of middle management, hiring staff, small business owners, and the politicians who are major shareholders, what I really hear them saying is that I paid off my student loans by taking advantage of others who were also in debt in a bad situation, and I was really hoping to continue exploiting that opportunity until I am retired or dead. This conversation hasn't taken into account people who end up dropping or flunking out of college. Because if you get 1.5 years in and already took out a bunch of loans, and then have to drop out for some reason, whether it's a financial burden that you didn't anticipate or medical reasons, your loans go back into repayment immediately. But assuming that everything goes perfectly, you find yourself able to come out ahead of whatever a minimum payment is. The reason I think you should be paying off student loans early rather than simply investing surplus into the market and hoping to make up the difference is because even if you lose everything in the market and come out a little wiser and are able to do it a little bit better the next time that you go about doing it and you have that risk tolerance, the loan debt doesn't change. If you invest instead of paying off debt, the burden of your debt is going to be the same if you go bankrupt. By paying off your debt, even if partially early, even if you're investing and paying off early and doing a mix of it, if you lose whatever you were investing, you don't lose the progress on paying off your debt early as long as you can clear a full loan. Because again, you need to really target and isolate these loans and pay them off individually, otherwise they're going to try and put you back on the original debt track, which if you do find yourself bankrupt will leave you in a very desperate position, whereas if you have already paid off a few of these smaller federal loans, you'll be in an infinitely better spot, or rather not infinitely but exponentially better spot, compounding interest. So I propose that the most patriotic thing you can do is to pay off your loans as early as possible so that you can be free, genuinely free, to pursue whatever you want, intellectually or otherwise. I really need to emphasize that I'm not any sort of financial guru. Far from it, in fact. I didn't trust my own gut while I was in college, and I took on far more debt than I was ever comfortable with. My student loans upon receiving my bachelor's were nearly $100,000 at an interest rate ranging between 3 and 13% depending on the loan. Today, after countless struggles, the highest interest rate of my federal student loans remaining is just under 5%, although we'll round it to 5% for easier math. And my remaining balance is far lower than it was 5 years ago when I graduated, but even if we assume it was still up at 100,000, going from between 3 and 13,000 in the negative interest down to between 3 and 5,000 debt interest has been akin to an enormous weight being lifted from my shoulders. Assuming that forgiveness was never in the cards, look at your own student loan debt and figure out how much it is costing you in accrued interest each year. If we assume you graduate $100K in debt at only a 3% interest rate, that's a great scenario in theory. If a sudden windfall occurs, how much would you be able to do with that extra $3K per year in your pocket? Would it let you trade your job for a less stressful occupation or give you a chance to finally pursue more of your hobbies? So why aren't you fighting to make that happen? If all of these financial gurus agree that one of the most important things that you could possibly invest in is yourself, then shouldn't reducing your overall stress level be the most important thing you can invest in? Because if we're being honest, you're not going to put your best foot forward if you're stressed and burnt out. By all means, if you can get yourself tools and equipment that could help you improve your earning potential, go get it. But if you're at a loss for what you're doing, just chip away at your debt and clear it. And I understand that that's easier said than done, but it is compounding in a negative if you don't. In other words, if you can't afford it today and you don't change anything else, you're going to be able to afford it even less tomorrow. Freedom isn't free, and the stock market exists to make the rich richer. They will absolutely rug pull you if they see the opportunity. The GameStop transfer of wealth was a very rare occurrence, and if you're banking on something like that happening again, you're effectively gambling. I'm not entirely bearish on the market, which is why I hold some index funds, but overall, I think that I'm better off paying off my debt. Of course, there's the opportunity cost of paying off your debt. You can't be investing it somewhere else, but what are the odds that you're actually able to beat the market? That's like one of the golden rules of investing, is no one actually does. More than the money matters themselves, make sure to take care of yourself. If you feel like you're burning the candle at both ends, it's probably because you are. Make sure you take the time off so you can recover and heal. Discomfort might be a catalyst for growth, but it's all about the dosage. Too much is poison and torture. A plant, given partial shade, might find a way to thrive, but without any sunlight or water and a nasty aphid infestation, do you expect it to flourish or perish? I don't think it's any secret that talking about money and how much people make for their salaries makes people uncomfortable, but that's one of those discomforts that actually provoke growth. There's a reason it's illegal for your employer to tell you not to discuss wages with your coworkers. And I think it's important that we don't just stop at wages, but also with budgeting and cost of living in your local area. And perhaps most importantly, debt, and how much debt everyone around you is actually in, especially the federal student loan debt. Because somewhere among your peers, most likely there is someone who has the means to create a startup. I don't even know that unionizing is in the cards anymore. We might all just need to go out and find a way to create independent ventures that deviate from the standard. And in a way, that's what I had always gone to college for. But somehow, at some point, it became a class check, where suddenly a bachelor's degree is basically being treated the way a high school diploma was 20, 30 years ago. Or at least by prospective employers. And if you're in the market for a job right now, I'm so sorry, I don't envy you, but I'm seeing postings that require master's degrees and PhDs that are utterly underwhelming compared to the cost of living for a single person in any state. And I don't think it's that the money isn't there to pay these people. I think it's that these companies can afford to continue not doing so because they know these people are desperate. And why are people at the highest tiers of education so desperate? It's because the prices keep going up and the compensation remains the same, if not continues going down. Over the years, I heard a pretty common saying that the only two things in life that are guaranteed are death and taxes, but I think it's high time that we include federal student loan debt on that list. Again, this has been all mostly anecdotal from my own experiences. I just want to get the ball rolling on this conversation because student loans are seldom covered in a realistic context by people currently incarcerated by them. I've been mostly away from my editing rig recently, picking up any extra work that I can, building some neat gadgets which I'll showcase at some point down the road. Any extra time and cash that I had been going towards getting that final loan over a 5% interest rate paid off. Actually, I had been grinding away at that one since before I had to rebuild my editing rig even, but I am excited to be more available to return to these projects which actually spark joy for me. I will be continuing with uploads of my Pokemon Uranium playthrough soon, and I have no plans of making this finance vlog with background gameplay into a recurring thing, although I might bring back the format for other abstract topics which are more on niche for me, because I do enjoy the way this turned out overall. I've had a pretty long history of Minecraft and hosting my own servers, specifically for Java Edition, although I do know there are ways to do that for Bedrock. I just don't play Bedrock myself. Big fan of self-hosting where you can, just in general. And Minecraft's a pretty good way to get your feet wet in the world of self-hosting. Something about virtual Legos, especially when the price of Legos themselves are on the rise. But having hosted a Java server over multiple versions on the same pieces of older hardware, I gotta say that Java Edition 1.21, the Tricky Trials update, has been surprisingly stable. I know that Java gets a lot of flack for how unoptimized and buggy it is, but I've had really good uptime for my server. Like version 1.20, I would have to reset every couple of hours, whereas 1.21 has been up for days at a time. Actually, I'm pretty sure I was pushing weeks right up until we had a power out. I've wanted a longer running, really fleshed out survival server for a long time now, and I feel like every time a new patch comes along, I update anyway, hoping that the stability gets better, and we finally actually have that. I think for the first time since the big ocean update. Depending on the group that I'm playing with, everyone always seems to want to start a new server, and I've been tempted to start like a paper MC or a bucket server that could host multiple worlds at once and then jump between them. I'm pretty sure the bungee cord plugin is for that. I just don't know if it's been updated to 1.21 yet. If I can get something working on 1.21 and just port all of these other worlds that I have scattered throughout time all the way up to the current version, I should have a relatively stable server. At least in theory, but you know, one project at a time, and I've been doing a lot of cleanup work in general, so I'd like to get back to Uranium, and I'm probably going to clean out some old tech before I see any more changes in my server architecture for Minecraft. Although the game is an amazing value for what you have to pay and the amount of content you get to play through. As long as you don't subscribe to Realms or their microtransactions on Bedrock, don't do that stuff. I mean, what? Mojang, don't ban me for preferring Java to Bedrock. Alright, this video is already long enough. If you made it this far, in the comments below, tell me which version of Minecraft you played first, and then tell me if there could only be one true version of Minecraft, the de facto version to play, which patch would it be and for which version? And thank you for helping me strive to be a better version of myself. Thanks.